The morning of January 22nd, Iten Jobai Sishasan hung heavy over Point Cruz. Second Lieutenant John George pressed himself into the ruins of a captured Japanese bunker, his eye fixed to a scope that had become the punchline of every joke in the officers' mess for 6 weeks. At 27, he was the 1,939 Illinois State Rifle Champion at 1,000 yards, the youngest winner in the competition's history. On Guadalcanal, his confirmed kill count stood at 0. The Winchester Model 70 inches his hands represented 2 years of National Guard paychecks and a deeper conviction that marksmanship was preparation for national defense, not just sport. When he'd unpacked the rifle at Camp Forest, Tennessee, with its Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount, the unit armorer had asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. Neither. George explained. It was for the Japanese. But the rifle never made it to the ship. While his regiment sailed for the Solomon Islands, the Winchester sat in an Illinois warehouse. George spent the Pacific crossing watching other men clean their M1 Garands, while his custom rifle traveled separately through military mail. 6 weeks after landing on Guadalcanal, a supply sergeant finally handed him a crate marked fragile. The mockery began immediately. Captain Morris called it a sporting rifle unsuitable for combat. The platoon leaders dubbed it his mail-order sweetheart. The Winchester weighed 9 pounds with scope, required bolt action between shots, and held only 5 rounds. Every M1 Garand in the battalion weighed about the same but was semi-automatic with 8 rounds and no magnification. Morris ordered George to leave the toy in his tent. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had relieved the Marines in late December 1942. The Marines had taken Henderson Field through hell itself. But Mount Austin remained unconquered, and Japanese forces controlled the coastal groves west of the Matnikau River. George's battalion attacked Mount Austin on December 17th, fighting 16 days through mud and volcanic rock, losing 34 killed and 279 wounded before taking the western slope on January 2nd. Through it all, George's Winchester remained unfired while men died with Garands in their hands. The jungle around Point Cruz presented different challenges. No bunkers, no fixed positions, just Japanese soldiers who had melted into the massive banyan trees. Some of them trained snipers with scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. On January 19th, they killed Corporal Davis at a creek. On the 20th, 2 men from L Company died on patrol. On the 21st, 3 more soldiers were shot. One through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot back, and he wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George laid out his credentials. Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. With the scope, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. George spent the night cleaning cosmoline from every surface of his Winchester despite having cleaned it before. At dawn on January 22nd, he moved into the captured bunker overlooking the coconut groves. Intelligence said the Japanese snipers worked from banyan trees that reached 90 feet with 8-foot trunks. A sniper could climb before dawn and remain invisible all day. George brought no spotter, no radio, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds. He settled in and began glassing the trees. The Lyman Alaskan's 2.5 power magnification wasn't much, but enough to see movement the naked eye would miss. At 9:17, he found his first target, a man in dark clothing 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met, watching the trail where George's battalion moved supplies. George made his adjustments for wind, controlled his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked. At Ikeuskirk yards, the Japanese sniper jerked and tumbled 90 feet to the ground. George worked the bolt smoothly and kept his scope on the tree. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. The spotter would be close. At 9:43, he found the second man in a different tree, 60 yards north. Climbing down, George fired. The sniper fell backward, his rifle clattering through branches ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded from a stripper clip. Hands steady. This was no different than Camp Perry, except these targets shot back. He discovered this at 11:21 when a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from his head, spraying dirt into his face. George rolled left, waited 3 minutes, then found the shooter, 73 feet up in a cluster of banyans. The sniper had repositioned to a different branch but remained in the same tree. George fired. The third man fell without sound. By noon, George had killed 5 snipers. Word spread through the battalion. Men who'd mocked his mail-order rifle now wanted to watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention, and attention drew fire. More importantly, the Japanese would adapt. They did. After the 5th kill, the remaining snipers stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon seeing nothing but leaves and shadows. At 1,600 hours, he returned to headquarters. Captain Morris waited with a different expression. The mockery had evaporated. He wanted George back at dawn. The job wasn't finished. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain that reduced visibility to nothing. George waited in the bunker until 0845, when enough visibility returned. The first sniper had climbed into position during the rain. Smart tactics. And had chosen a tree 290 yards out. Longer range than yesterday. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated and fired. 6 kills. The 6th kill brought Japanese mortars. They'd triangulated his position. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second 20 yards short. George understood geometry. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted north, diving into a shell crater as the 3rd salvo obliterated his bunker. He relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards away and resumed work. The afternoon became a duel. At 1,423, he killed number 7. At 1,541, number 8, a man 94 feet up whose height created a silhouette when the sun angle changed. By evening, Morris wanted numbers. 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired. 4 misses. George was assigned to continue at dawn. That night, George considered the mathematics. Intelligence said 11 Japanese snipers operated in the Point Cruz groves. 8 now dead. 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the best. The ones who'd survived longest. And now they knew exactly what he looked like and what rifle he carried. At 0300, George gave up trying to sleep. The rain started again at 0415. He used the delay to relocate to a cluster of rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest. At 0817 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9 in a palm tree, only 40 feet up, Unusual. George aimed, controlled his breathing, then stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. After 3 days and 8 kills, the remaining snipers wouldn't make elementary mistakes unless it was bait. George scanned surrounding trees methodically. 11 minutes later, he found the real threat, a banyan tree 80 yards northwest. 91 feet up, perfectly concealed. The sniper had a clear line of sight to George's previous position, waiting for him to take the bait. George made a decision. He fired at the decoy in the palm. As that sniper fell, George immediately swung toward the banyan. The real sniper was turning toward the sound. George fired before he could fully turn. Both snipers fell, but George had revealed his position. He grabbed his rifle and ran as Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he'd been positioned seconds earlier. After relocating to a water-filled crater, George resumed his hunt. 10 confirmed kills. 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best. At 0947, George realized his mistake. The sniper wasn't in the trees, he was on the ground, crawling through undergrowth toward George's last position. George watched as the sniper reached the rocks, took up a position facing the wrong direction, his back exposed. An easy shot at 38 yards. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days when others had died from mistakes. The exposed position was too vulnerable. This had to be another decoy. George expanded his scan and found the second soldier behind a fallen tree trunk, 70 yards northwest. Watching. Waiting. 2 men working together. George couldn't shoot both before they reacted. He submerged in the water until only his eyes remained visible and waited. At 1013, the soldier in the rocks stood up, having seen nothing, and signaled his partner. Both men began moving east in a sweep pattern. They passed George's crater, backs now exposed. George rose from the water, aimed at the closer man, and fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, swung toward the second man who was turning and raising his rifle. George fired first. 11 shots. 11 snipers. Dead. But as George climbed from the crater, he heard Japanese voices. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. Not snipers. Infantry. A patrol or recovery team. George had killed the snipers, but they hadn't been working alone. What followed was chaos. George dropped back into the crater as 6 or more Japanese soldiers found the bodies and tracked his boot prints. When a soldier appeared at the crater rim looking directly at him, George fired from the water. The firefight lasted minutes. George killed 3 more soldiers, then ran north under fire, sprinting through jungle with bullets snapping past, until he broke contact and reached American lines at 1113. At headquarters, Morris wanted the debrief. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds for the snipers. 5 more in the firefight. Morris told him to clean his rifle and rest. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. But at 1,400 hours, Colonel Ferry summoned George. Ferry had one question: could George train other men? Division had 14 Springfield rifles with honorable scopes left by the Marines. Ferry had 40 expert marksmen. Ferry wanted a sniper section. George accepted on one condition: he kept his Winchester. Training began January 27th. George taught fundamentals: breathing, trigger control, reading wind, By January 30th, 32 men could hit man-sized targets at 300 yards. George organized them into 16 two-man teams and took 4 teams into the field February 1st. Over 12 days, George's sniper section killed 74 Japanese soldiers with 0 friendly casualties. On February 7th, a Japanese rifleman shot George in the left shoulder. The bullet passed through muscle. Serious but not fatal. He spent 2 weeks recovering as the Japanese completed their evacuation. The Guadalcanal campaign was over. While George recovered, orders came from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced officers for a classified mission in Burma. George volunteered. By March, he was on a transport heading west, his Winchester packed in a waterproof case. The mission was Merrill's Marauders, the 5,307th Composite Unit, modeled after British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits. 3,000 men for long-range penetration behind Japanese lines in Burma. George was assigned to 2nd Battalion, officially a rifle platoon leader, but command knew what he could do with a rifle. For the Burma mission, George modified his equipment. Every ounce mattered on patrols lasting weeks over hundreds of miles. He replaced the Lyman Alaskan with a lighter Weaver 330 scope and swapped the wood stock for synthetic, reducing the rifle from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944 with a mission to capture the Myitkyina airfield through terrain the Japanese considered impassable. George's battalion began the march February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria spread. By March, they'd covered 217 miles and engaged Japanese forces 12 times. George used his Winchester only 3 times during the entire march. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer at a river crossing, once at 380 yards against a machine gun position, once at 290 yards against a sniper. 3 shots, 3 kills. He never fired more than once per engagement. The Winchester's distinctive report would give away his position. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months and over 700 miles. They'd lost more men to disease than combat. The unit that entered Burma with 300 men was down to fewer than 3,000 effectives. On May 17th, they captured Myitkyina airfield, but the cost was severe. The unit was combat ineffective. George survived Burma, as did his Winchester. But he realized something during those 3 months. The rifle had been used only 7 times because the Marauders rarely engaged in long-range precision shooting. Most combat was close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less in dense vegetation. Modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the M1 Garand were becoming standard. By June 1944, George was evacuated with the disbanded Marauders and reassigned to training duties at Fort Benning, Georgia. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia, killing at least 14 confirmed enemy soldiers. Probably more. George was discharged in January 1947 as lieutenant colonel with 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and Combat Infantry Badge. He enrolled at Princeton on the GI Bill, studied politics, and graduated with highest honors in 1950. After 4 years at Oxford and 4 years in British East Africa, he settled in Washington, D.C., eventually joining the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant on African affairs. George never spoke publicly about his war during those years. Colleagues knew he'd served in the Pacific, but they didn't know about Point Cruz or the 11 snipers or the Winchester Model 70 that sat in a case in his home. In 1947, George began writing, not for publication, just to document weapons and tactics while details were fresh. 6 months later, he had over 400 pages of technical descriptions, rifles, ammunition, ballistics. A friend at the National Rifle Association convinced him to publish. Shots Fired in Anger became a classic, describing George's experiences with clinical precision. No embellishment, no hero worship, just facts about what worked and what didn't. The book is still in print today, still referenced by historians studying World War II small arms. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain among the most detailed contemporary accounts available. George lived to see 3 more American wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. He watched military rifles evolve from the M1 Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated training and equipment. He watched new generations relearn and refine the lessons of World War II. What George had proven in 4 days on Guadalcanal was revolutionary, that individual marksmanship still mattered in modern warfare. That precision could be more effective than volume of fire, that a skilled civilian shooter with the right equipment could outperform professionally trained military snipers. His sniper section concept, 2-man teams with dedicated training, became the foundation for modern American sniper doctrine. The Winchester Model 70, meanwhile, earned its own place in military history, though never officially adopted. Individual Model 72nds found their way into combat throughout the Pacific Campaign, carried by Marines who refused to leave their preferred rifles at home. After World War II, the rifle gained legendary status. In Vietnam, Marine Corps snipers, including the famous Carlos Hathcock, preferred the Model 70 over issued rifles. Hathcock used a Model 70 with an 8x Unsuitable scope throughout his service, including his famous shot that killed a North Vietnamese sniper by shooting through the enemy's scope. The pre-1964 Model 70, with its controlled round feed, Mauser action, and hand-fitted components, remains one of the most sought-after rifles among collectors. The model George carried with its Lyman Alaskan scope, modified trigger, and combat history represented the pinnacle of American sporting rifle craftsmanship applied to warfare. John B. George died January 3rd. Lanchin, at 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that had killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle, but it represents something more profound. It's the rifle that proved individual skill matters, that civilian marksmanship can translate to military effectiveness, that sometimes the right man with the right tool can change the outcome of battles. It's the rifle that battalion commanders called a toy until the morning they needed someone who could actually shoot. It's the rifle that earned the nickname Mail Order Sweetheart from officers who later recommended its owner for Bronze Stars. The story of John George and his Winchester Model 70 reminds us that warfare isn't just about industrial production and standardization. Though those matter, it's also about the individual soldier, his training, his skill, his equipment, his judgment under fire. George bought that rifle with his own money because he believed marksmanship was preparation for defending his nation. When the test came in the jungles of Guadalcanal, he proved himself right. In 4 days in January 1943, facing 11 enemy snipers who had killed 14 Americans, George eliminated the threat with precision and patience. 11 shots for 11 snipers. In doing so, he demonstrated principles that remain true today. That quality can triumph over quantity. That precision matters. That the craftsman's approach to soldiering, taking the time to do things right, produces results that brute force cannot match. The Winchester Model 70. The rifleman's rifle. In George's hands, it became something more, proof that in the chaos and brutality of modern war, there's still room for skill, for precision, for the individual marksman who takes the time to aim true. They mocked his mail-order rifle until he used it to save their lives. History vindicated him completely.